In 2007, a group of researchers began trying to save something that was very close to being lost forever. Not a famous painting, not a shipwreck, not some secret government file. Paper records from Central State Hospital in Virginia. There were admission forms, medical notes, court papers, staff reports, and death records. Some had been sitting in poor storage conditions for decades. Together, the collection ran into more than 800,000 pages. That figure is almost too large to picture, but the real importance of the archive is not its size. It is what the pages say about the people who passed through the hospital and about the society that sent them there. Central State began during the chaos that followed the Civil War. Slavery had ended, but freedom did not suddenly create housing, medical care, stable jobs, or protection for formerly enslaved people. Virginia was rebuilding its government while trying to preserve as much of the old racial order as it could. In Richmond, Howard's Grove Hospital had been a Confederate medical facility. After the war, it was repurposed for black patients and other people in desperate circumstances. In December 1869, Union General Edward Canby issued General Order 136, transferring responsibility for the facility to the Commonwealth of Virginia. The wording in the records is blunt. The hospital held 123 people classified as insane, along with 100 others described as poor but not insane. That detail tells us something immediately. This was never just a hospital for people with clearly defined psychiatric illnesses. It was also dealing with poverty, homelessness, physical illness, old age, disability, and people who had nowhere else to go. Those categories could overlap. A person might need medical help, shelter, family support, or protection from exploitation. But in 19th century Virginia, the state did not have a separate answer for every problem. Sometimes the answer was an institution, and once a person entered that institution, a complicated life could be reduced to a single label: insane. The hospital was first known as the Central Lunatic Asylum for Colored Insane. It is an uncomfortable name, but it is historically important because it shows how the state classified the people inside. Their race came before their individual story. In 1882, the city of Petersburg purchased Mayfield Farm in Dinwiddie County and gave the property to the Commonwealth. A larger permanent hospital was built there, and on March 22, 1885, 373 patients were moved from Richmond to the new site. On paper, the move looked like progress. There was more land, more room, and a chance to build a self-contained institution. But moving a hospital away from the city also made the people inside it easier to ignore. Families had farther to travel. The public saw less of what happened there. The institution became its own world. The system followed the ideas of 19th century psychiatric care. Patients lived according to strict routines and were separated by sex, diagnosis, and behavior. Many worked in the fields, kitchens, laundry rooms, workshops, and around the grounds. The hospital called this therapeutic occupation. Work could give patients structure, and some people may genuinely have found routine useful. But there was another side to it. Patients were not ordinary employees. They could not negotiate wages or decide freely whether to leave. The line between treatment and unpaid institutional labor was often very thin. By 1895, the institution was known as Central State Hospital. It stayed connected to Virginia's segregated public health system for roughly a century. Black patients were sent there because black and white Virginians did not have equal access to the same psychiatric hospitals. That separation affected everything: who was admitted, how people were described, what resources were available, and how often families could visit. The hospital's paperwork asked for a person's name, age, race, occupation, marital status, diagnosis, cause of illness, length of stay, and condition at discharge. Those details are useful to historians now, but at the time they were tools of administration. The institution needed to know how to classify a person, where to place them, and how to manage them. The patient's own explanation was not always given the same importance. That is one reason the archive has to be read carefully. It is valuable, but it is not neutral. Most of the surviving records were written by doctors, administrators, courts, police officers, or family members. They tell us what the institution noticed. They do not always tell us what the patient thought was happening. For decades, these records were treated as old paperwork rather than historical evidence. Some were kept in environments with heat, humidity, sunlight, and frequent handling. Others were threatened by record retention rules. If nobody intervened, huge parts of Black psychiatric history could simply have been destroyed. King Davis, a mental health researcher who had also served as Virginia's Commissioner of Mental Health, became involved in efforts to preserve the collection. Researchers at the University of Texas and other institutions helped collect, copy, organize, and digitize the material. More than 800,000 pages were preserved. Inside them were thousands of lives, but also a record of changing medical language. Researchers found hundreds of diagnostic labels in the historical material. When those labels were grouped for analysis, psychosis was the largest category in the data Davis examined, accounting for about 66% of admissions. Dementia was another major category. Those numbers should not be treated as proof that every diagnosis was wrong. They should also not be treated as proof that the system was fair. The early records show that many admissions were connected to homelessness, poverty, developmental disabilities, and the lack of other health care. Central State was being asked to solve problems that were not really medical problems at all. If a family had no money and could not care for an elderly relative, the hospital might become the only option. If someone was homeless, they might be treated as a public problem before anyone asked what support they needed. If poverty brought a person into contact with police or local officials, psychiatric commitment could become part of the response. This is where the history becomes difficult to simplify. Central State was an institution of confinement, but it was also one of the only places where many patients could get food, shelter, medical attention, and a daily routine. It could offer care while taking away freedom. It could protect someone from one danger while removing their ability to make ordinary choices. Both descriptions can be true at the same time. The records also change as the decades pass. Admissions and several diagnostic categories rose sharply during the 1920s and 1930s, years marked by the Great Depression, racial violence, and economic instability. Black Virginians faced those pressures alongside discrimination in jobs, housing, education, and health care. A diagnosis may describe a person's symptoms, but it can also reflect the circumstances around that person. The doctor was not examining a mind in isolation. The doctor was seeing someone brought in by a family member, a court, a jail, or a local authority. The language used to describe behavior came from the assumptions of that period. Once written down, the label could follow a person for years. There is a further problem with reading these files. How much of the archive is actually the patient's story? A patient might disagree with a diagnosis, but that disagreement could be recorded as another sign of illness. A patient might refuse to speak, and that silence could be interpreted in whatever way the institution found convenient. A patient's explanation might be reduced to a few lines, while the doctor's description filled an entire page. The archive survived, but the power inside the archive was not shared equally. If you're finding this history worth following, subscribe now. I'm building this series around real records, forgotten institutions, and the evidence that survives after the official story goes quiet. And tell me in the comments, should we trust an institution's paperwork when the patient had almost no chance to answer back? By the 1960s, Central State had grown into a massive institution serving thousands of patients. It had wards, farms, staff housing, workshops, medical buildings, and burial grounds. At that scale, individual lives could disappear into the population count. A person could become a number. A death could become a line in a register. A family could receive a letter instead of having the chance to say goodbye. That is why the cemetery connected to the hospital matters. Parts of the campus contain burial grounds where many people were buried without permanent markers identifying them by name. The ground is still there, but the individual stories are much harder to see. This is not evidence of one secret massacre. The stronger conclusion is quieter. For decades, institutional deaths could pass through the system without becoming part of public memory. Preservation work is now trying to change that. Historians, archivists, descendants, and researchers are using the records to connect names with lives. A county can identify where someone came from. An occupation can tell us what kind of work they did. A discharge record can show that a person went home. A death entry can help locate where they were buried. Each detail is small, but it pushes back against the idea that the people at Central State were only patients. They were workers, parents, relatives, church members, neighbors, and members of communities that existed long before admission. The archive does not prove that every diagnosis was false. It does not prove that every member of staff was cruel. Some patients clearly needed psychiatric care, and some families were desperate for help. What it does show is that all of this happened inside a segregated society. Black patients had fewer choices. Their care was shaped by racial policy, economic inequality, and the medical ideas of the time. Many people were admitted because there was nowhere else for them to go. That makes Central State more than a story about an old hospital. It is a story about what happens when a government places too many social problems inside one institution and then calls the arrangement treatment. A state could build a separate hospital for Black patients and describe it as progress. A family could send someone away because there was no other support. A doctor could turn a complicated life into a diagnosis. And a government could preserve thousands of names on paper while allowing the people behind those names to disappear from public memory. So what did the archive expose? Not one hidden conspiracy, not one villain responsible for everything. It exposed a system created after emancipation, shaped by segregation, expanded by poverty, and preserved in paperwork. It shows that medical history is also a history of power. Who gets believed? Who gets labeled? Who gets removed from the community? Who gets remembered after death? Central State Hospital still forms part of Virginia's mental health system, but its historical records tell a national story. They show how America handled people it did not know how to support, and how race influenced the definition of mental illness. More than 800,000 pages survived. That is extraordinary, but survival is not the same thing as justice. A file can preserve a name without restoring a life. A cemetery can preserve a location without telling us everything about the person buried there. The most defensible conclusion is not that everyone admitted to Central State was wrongly imprisoned. It is that the hospital was forced to serve too many roles at once: psychiatric hospital, shelter, medical facility, workplace, and segregated state institution. For many people, it was the only place Virginia had created for those who had nowhere else to go. That is why the records matter. They do not give us a clean answer. They make us ask a better question. When a government calls something treatment, who gets to decide? And when a diagnosis survives in an archive, how much of it describes the patient, and how much describes the society around them? Central State Hospital's darkest secret may not be something hidden behind the walls. It may be how easily the outside world accepted that the people inside could be forgotten. If this episode stayed with you, tap like, subscribe for episode 2, and leave one comment before you go. When a hospital, a court, and a family all describe the same person differently, whose version should history remember?